Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 22 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries both natural and supernatural from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about Bob Lazar and Area 51. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today, as always, is Jimmy Akin. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
We'd like to take a moment at the top of the show to thank our patrons who make this show possible. Today, we want to thank by name Lawrence Z., Maria N., Patricia R., Ron S., and Ryan W. Through their generous donations at sqpn.com/give, they make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at sqpn.com, and you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. So, Jimmy, we've talked about Area 51 already, and in that show, which was within our first four shows, I think it was like our second or third show, might have been our fourth one. We mentioned this fellow named Bob Lazar, and you said we were going to come back because there's more to say about him. So what is it? Who is Bob Lazar?
Well, back in 1989, a Nevada man, Bob Lazar, made international news when he went public. He claimed to have worked at Area 51, where he reverse engineered flying saucers that were kept at the facility. He was the man who made Area 51 famous. Before him, it was not known by the general public. And now there's a new documentary about Bob Lazar, so we're going to be taking a look at the documentary and the whole Bob Lazar case. Okay,
so this guy really is sort of the linchpin to all the mythology and the information we have about Area 51, and so that makes sense that we want to dig deep into his story. So, what do we have to work with? What are the claims that are being made by and about Bob Lazar?
Well, so let's start by talking about the new documentary. It's called Bob Lazar, Area 51 and Flying Saucers. It's available on Amazon and iTunes and YouTube for a fee and other places. It's made by a filmmaker named Jeremy Corbell, and it features extensive interviews with Bob Lazar and also with a journalist from Las Vegas named George Knapp. Knapp was the man in 1989 who first interviewed Lazar for, I believe it was KLAS Television, the station that Knapp worked for. And the documentary includes a lot of footage from 1989, as well as contemporary footage that Corbell went and got in the making of the documentary. It's an entertaining documentary. It has an interesting mood. At times it has these kind of poetic psychedelic interludes with this sort of pseudo-profound narration, kind of like Chris Carter narration from the X-Files or something. And it's got a dramatic structure. It starts out with Corbell himself receiving texts from Lazar saying there's an FBI raid on his business happening right now. And then we back up and we build up to that. And then that FBI raid is kind of the climax of the documentary. So it's a very interesting documentary. I found it personally, though, intellectually unsatisfying. Even though I thought it was enjoyable, it basically presents a kind of stripped down version of Lazar's claims. It doesn't go into all of them, all the different things he's claimed over the years, and it doesn't lay out or analyze his claims systematically. It didn't ask a lot of the questions that I thought needed to be asked or make points that I thought needed to be made. One of the things, since I work as an apologist, I kind of think simultaneously like both a prosecutor and a defense attorney. I want to make the best case I can for both sides. And I think that's something that listeners to this podcast will probably have picked up on, that I try to be fair to both sides. I try to argue both ways. And so what I was hoping the documentary would be something like that it would say, okay, here are Lazar's claims. Let's take them one by one. Let's look at the evidence for and against them. And it didn't do that. At least it didn't do that in the sharp way. I mean, the focused, kind of hard-hitting way that I hoped it would. So I found it a little disappointing in that respect, but it was still entertaining. In terms of what Bob himself claims, he says that he start with his educational and work background. He says he claims he says he received master's degrees both from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, near where you are,
exactly,
Dom, and also Caltech, out near where I am. And he claims to have worked at Los Alamos National Laboratories in New Mexico. And he then left the employ of Los Alamos. And in 1988, he was working as a self-employed photo processor. Back, before we had digital cameras, when everybody had to go to a photo shop to get their photos processed.
Ask your parents, kids.
Yeah. There was this thing called film.
And you had to drive to this little booth and drop it off. Right.
Yeah. So he was independently processing photos then. But according to him, he had previously, back when he worked at Los Alamos, he had met Edward Teller. Edward Teller was a very famous 20th century physicist who would have reason to visit Los Alamos. He was one of the fathers of the atomic bomb and so forth. And then, according to Lazar, as far as he can tell, it was Edward Teller who played a role in him getting a job at Area 51. The claim is basically that somehow Edward Teller had recommended him for this position. He claims his background was then, because if you're going to work at Area 51, you're going to get a background check. And he says his background was checked by a man named Mike Thigpen, and that he then worked at not at Area 51 itself exactly, but at an associated area just adjacent to Area 51 in the Nevada desert called S4. And he worked, he says, at S4 for about 6 months. While he was there, he was shown briefing documents that provided an overview. He says there was like 100, 120 briefing documents they had in this little room. And when he wasn't working on the project, he was like, when they first brought him in, he was expected to sit here and read these. And he says most of them dealt with like the attempts to reverse engineer the UFOs that they had, and that they were kind of at a stalled out point, but these briefing documents provided a history of what they'd been doing to try to figure out this technology. And there were also other briefing documents that talked about the inhabitants of the original inhabitants of the flying saucers, that they were the race popularly known now as the Greys, the little short people with the big heads and the big eyes. The briefing documents, he said, referred to them as being from Zeta Reticuli, which is the star system that is commonly thought to have been shown to Betty Hill on the star map that she was shown by the aliens. According to these briefing documents, they had been on Earth apparently even millions of years ago, and they'd been guiding our development for at least 10,000 years. He says that we had these 9 flying saucers, most of which looked like they were in working order. It wasn't clear to Lazar exactly how we got these, whether the aliens themselves gave them to us or we found them and dug them up, or exactly how we got them. But they had them in these hangars built into the side of a mountain out at S4 that were camouflaged to, the hangar doors were camouflaged to look like part of the mountain. And we had an agreement with the Greys to kind of train us, and they were actually here at S4 as some kind of scientific cultural exchange program until the 1970s. And then in the 1970s, so this is like, a little more than a decade. This is about a decade before Lazar comes to work there. There was some kind of a dispute that happened with the guards at Area 51, and the aliens ended up leaving But they said they'd come back at some future date that Lazar didn't know, and we kept the flying saucers. So then he's brought in, he says, to try to reverse engineer the propulsion system of the ship, based on his background, in engineering and so forth from MIT and Caltech. He says that they were kind of stalled, and so he was brought in sort of like for a fresh perspective. And according to him, the drive system for the flying saucer runs off element 115, which at the time was not yet discovered. We've since manufactured some element 115, and it's now known as muscovium. It was one of the recently named elements on the periodic table. Also, he claimed that the drive system ran on antimatter. And basically, he said that the drive created gravity waves that would then guide and move the ship. He compares it to like if you put a bowling ball on a bed and then punch down on the mattress in front of the bowling ball, it'll make the bowling ball roll towards where you've punched it down. And this is kind of a similar space warping gravity drive that would pull things toward it. He claims that the government has an astonishingly large quantity of element 115, that they have about 500 pounds of it, and that it's in a stable form, which is very different than the element 115 we were able to manufacture. With great effort, we were able to manufacture 4 atoms of it, and they had a half-life of just a tiny fraction of a second, like, very, very, small, like
right,
teeny fraction, and then they fell apart and were no longer element 115.
When you get to the top end of the periodic table of elements, none of those things actually occur in nature, as far as we know,
right.
And they are extremely hard to make, extremely rare, and extremely short-lived, as far as our science goes.
Yeah, what happens is as the nucleus of an atom gets bigger, it gets harder for the forces to hold it together. And so they have a tendency to fission and split into smaller elements to emit neutrons, for example, other like particles that will then cause them, like alpha particles, that will cause them to turn into other elements. And that's why nuclear fission happens with those big, heavy elements. But it is hypothesized there may be an island of stability somewhere up there where they're not as radioactive and they have longer half-lives. In any event, he claims and he's kind of ambiguous on this. It appears he claims that, or claimed at some point, that he took a small sample of element 115, but the government may or may not have stolen it back. In any event, he says, while he was there, to tell other people about his work. And he even took people out to the desert to watch test flights of UFOs over Papoose Lake, which is in the S4 area near Groom Lake, which is both of these are dry lake beds. They're lakes that used to have water in them, but now they're dried up. And Groom Lake is the one at Area 51. Papoose Lake is the one next to it. He then, as a result of that, began to be threatened and intimidated in various ways by security forces connected with Area 51 and S4. And so finally he went public with George Knapp, in part to prevent the threats against him from being carried out. So like to make himself too big a target for anybody to shoot at, so to speak.
Okay. And so these are the claims where you made a judgment about any of them yet,
right.
But these are his claims. So what would be the counterclaims? What would people say in opposition to these claims?
Well, there are several different versions. Probably the mildest counterclaim is that Lazar's story is basically true, but that he's embellished it a little bit, like making up degrees that he doesn't really have to make himself seem more important. Sometimes people will embellish their educational or work record. A little more sinister than that would be the claim that that he did work there, but to some degree he was the victim of a disinformation campaign that he was basically a tool. And they brought him out there and showed him stuff and told him stuff about it in order to manipulate him. Maybe to find out, will he go to the press with this, in which case we know we cannot trust him with the real secrets? Or maybe to get this idea out there and maybe convince the Soviets that we've got technology from aliens and they better not mess with us, because this is the end of the Cold War. Russia was just about to fall apart. And or maybe for some other reason, but you know, maybe he's telling the truth as he sees it, but he's been deliberately deceived. And even he is willing to say stuff like, I can only tell you about the engines I saw and worked on. These documents that I saw in the briefing room and was expected to read, I have no idea if what they're saying is true. This is just what was told to me. So that's kind of the next level counterclaim. And then there's the kind of final counterclaim, which is the strongest, that Lazar is just a hoaxer and that he made up all these wild claims for some reason, presumably for the thrill of getting away with a hoax or for attention or something like that. Apparently not money, because he has never written a book or anything like that.
Okay. So we have the claims and counterclaims. What do we know? What evidence do we have for and against these various claims?
Well, it's now well established that Lazar's claim that Area 51 exists is true. That was not commonly known when he initially came out in 1989, but it's now well established. It's the world's most famous secret base. It's also apparently true that there is an affiliated institution called S4 that's out there in the desert. That's one of the things that George Knapp was able to confirm by talking to sources in the government, that there is an S4, and that also was not commonly known at the time. Lazar did work at Los Alamos. We know that's the case. Initially, when Los Alamos was contacted, they said, we never heard of this guy. But subsequent to that, a newspaper was found that recorded Lazar working there. In fact, it talked about him building a kind of a jet car. This is one of his hobbies. He builds jet propelled cars and bicycles for fun. And so there was a newspaper story about him there from Los Alamos. And also there was a phone book for Los Alamos that he was listed in. But the way he was listed in it was interesting. The phone book didn't just include people who were employed by the Los Alamos National Laboratories itself. It also included people who were working there as contractors. And the coding next to Lazar's name in the phone book would suggest that he was not an employee of Los Alamos itself. He was the employee of a contractor named Kirk Meyer. And that so he was one of many Kirk Meyer employees working there. And it seems that rather than being like a scientist himself there, he may have been like a technician assisting scientists. Okay. We also know now that element 115 is real, and it is possible for that element to exist because we made it. And we do know also that Lazar did take people out to view test flights of some kind over Papoose Lake. And there's even shaky, grainy 1989 videotapes of this happening, which you can find on YouTube.
Why can't anyone ever use a tripod?
I know.
Just, people, if you're going to take video of these amazing things, use a tripod. All right. So that's the various evidence, the facts that are in not in contention. So let's take this from the faith perspective, which we always do. First, is there a faith perspective on Bob Lazar's story?
Well, if as we've discussed previously, talking about aliens on this show, the existence of aliens doesn't really have an impact on the Christian faith one way or another. It would just mean God has made additional intelligent creatures elsewhere, which we already know he's done in at least one case in the spiritual world because there are angels. And so it would just mean, okay, he also made some additional creatures that are intelligent here in the material world and presumably made them similarly to the way he did us, using the natural forces of evolution on their planet and guiding them and so forth. So that wouldn't be a big deal. There are some statements that Lazar has made over the years that do engage this area a little more. I was able to find one interview with him where he did say something about aliens and religion, but he didn't really want to go into it because he said it would just upset everybody. And so that's a little ominous. He also, and I'll have a link to an article for this in the show notes, but he also talked to a couple of different people, one of them being George Knapp, about the aliens referring to us as containers and saying that containers like us are very, very hard to find. And he didn't know exactly what they meant by containers, but he thought they might mean containers for souls, and that they had an interest in our souls and maybe harvesting our souls or something. But it doesn't seem, from what I've been able to find, that was directly claimed in the briefing documents. That was more his interpretation. Also, it was apparently indicated in the briefing documents, he says he saw, that aliens had interfered in human development. And some people might say, well, how would that square with the idea that God made us? Which is clearly taught in Scripture, and it wouldn't necessarily conflict with that. We can do genetic engineering now. We're on the verge of being able to do it on a much broader scale. And if it turned out that that another alien race had come in and done a little genetic engineering on us, that wouldn't change the fact that fundamentally God's in control of everything. And even if he uses secondary causes to achieve his ends, he's still ultimately responsible for our creation, just like he's responsible for the creation of the world.
We kind of talked about that a little bit in our episode on transhumanism.
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So that's the faith perspective, and it's interesting. What about this is probably going to be the bulk of what we discussed, the reason perspective on these claims and evidence.
Okay, so one thing that's often pointed out in Lazar's favor is that he took some lie detector tests that he passed. And if you take lie detector tests seriously, that would give you reason to give some credence to his claims. I don't take lie detector tests seriously. Lie detectors are not reliable. I mean, maybe in the future we're going to have brain reading lie detectors that are reliable, but right now lie detectors are unreliable enough that we know they've missed like spies. Kim Philby in the UK, who was a Soviet agent and also working high up in British intelligence, he would take a tranquilizer before every lie detector test and sail through it. Mm-hmm. Other people just have no trouble lying. I mean, sociopaths, for example, have weird emotional responses to things, and could have no moral compunction about lying and feel very confident in themselves. And again, just sail through a lie detector test. And so lie detectors are unreliable enough that they are not used as evidence in American courts these days. Right. So I don't give Bob's claims any particular credence on the basis of lie detector tests. One of the things that people will ask who do give credence to his claims is, well, how would he have known some of these things that he did know that were not common knowledge at the time? And if his story was just fundamentally untrue, how would he know these things? And we'll come back to that. There are a bunch of interesting points in his story, but unfortunately for me, they involve multiple instances of what I call Sherlock Holmes in the case of the missing evidence. This is where you make a very interesting claim that would really support your story if we had the evidence, but for one convenient reason or another, we don't have the evidence. So, for example, his degrees at MIT and Caltech, he claims he had these master's degrees, but MIT and Caltech says they never granted any degrees to this guy, that he wasn't a student there. Now the counter argument to that is, well, the government disappeared these degrees, so that they erased the records of them so that they could discredit him. Well, that would be hard to do, number one. I mean, what, there's not a yearbook or something? I mean, if they printed a yearbook, there would have been hundreds or thousands of copies of it with Bob Lazar listed in the yearbook. And there's no way they can go out into people's homes and retrieve all those yearbooks and replace them with sanitized copies. This is a point that I frequently make in apologetics regarding scripture. When people say, oh, someone took this out of the Bible. Really? They went out to the desert and dug up all those forgotten copies that archaeologists have now found and sanitized them and reburied them? That doesn't make sense. So it would be very hard for them to sanitize away degrees like that. And why would they go to the effort when there are other ways to discredit him? But fundamentally, we don't have the evidence that supports his claim. There's no evidence of these degrees, so we have missing evidence. Similarly, Edward Teller he said, and he's passed on now, but he said he did not remember meeting Bob Lazar. He didn't say he didn't meet him, but he didn't remember meeting him.
And this would have been closer in time to that alleged meeting, right? Yeah, this would have decades later.
No, would have been in the 1990s, so it would have been just a few years difference from the 1980s when he worked at Los Alamos. So again, there's no evidence to support this claim. Lazar, even though he seems to have claimed to have had some 115, he hasn't produced it. Now, if he had stable 115, that would really support his claim, because where is he going to get stable 115? But we don't have the evidence. He hasn't produced it if he's still got it. And it doesn't fit with what we know about the 115 we've manufactured. I mean, it's hypothetically possible there could be a stable isotope of 115, but it's not the one we made. And so, again, we just don't have evidence to support his story here. His story also, in addition to having missing evidence, contains claims that are implausible. Now, I know he said Edward Teller. Apparently, the story is he kind of showed off his rocket car to Edward Teller, and that impressed Teller and led Teller to make a recommendation. But how likely is it really that someone who's working as a self-employed photo processor is going to be, even with a couple of degrees, is going to be hired to reverse engineer an alien spacecraft drive?
No matter how impressive his rocket car is.
Yeah. I mean, you would expect someone with like a doctorate in physics or engineering or something like that, not a guy who's just claiming a couple of master's degrees, right? Especially not one who's down on his luck enough to not even be working currently in the industry and to be working as a photo processor.
Right. There had to be 150 other guys in this country more qualified than he was at the time. Yeah.
So it's unlikely someone with his work and educational background would be hired. And it's also unlikely, even if he were hired, that they would show him the kinds of briefing documents that they did, according to his claims. Because one of the things about the way these projects work is the information is highly compartmentalized. For example, now, if we had alien spacecraft, this would be a secret equal and beyond the making of the atomic bomb in magnitude. But when the Manhattan Project was underway out there in New Mexico, what they did was they divided the work crew up into teams, and you were only given the information that you needed to do your job in your team. So they had lots of people who did not even know they were working on an atomic bomb. All they know, for example, a lot of the wives of the scientists who were out there back in the 40s were bored out of their minds in the desert, and they were desperate to do something. And so the facility, and this is the idea of Richard Feynman, the physicist. They used, since they didn't have mechanical machines to do the calculations for them, these all had to be done by hand. And so they took the wives and organized them into teams to run the calculations they needed to do as part of the atomic bomb design. And they became known as computers. because it was their job to compute.
Right.
And later that term got transferred to a machine that does the same thing. But originally a computer was a person that does computing, just like originally a typewriter was a person who does typewriting. But even among the scientists, there was a big compartmentalization of information. You only were told what you needed to do. And so even if he had been brought in, Lazar had been brought in to reverse engineer this ship and its engine, why would they be giving him briefing documents talking about Zeta Reticuli and 10,000 years of involvement and manipulation and things like that? That doesn't make any sense. Okay. So that's implausible right there. Then there are scientific claims that Lazar makes that seem sloppy and just don't make any sense. And I'll have a link in the show notes to a critique of Lazar's claims by an actual physicist. So you can read this, and he puts it in layman's language so you can understand it. But just reading it myself, I was kind of floored by a couple of the claims that Lazar had made in the past. One of them, I mean, just based on my knowledge of physics, one of the claims that he makes, because this is a gravity manipulation drive, and he says there's something he calls a gravity A wave. And this is one of his terms that he uses, that the drive apparently involves a gravity A wave. And he says it's the same thing that's ordinarily called the strong nuclear force.
Yeah.
Well, no. Gravity and the nuclear, there are four fundamental forces that we know of. Gravity, electromagnetism, the weak nuclear force, and the strong nuclear force.
Right. This is basic high school physics.
Yeah, exactly. And they each have different properties. So gravity has very different properties than the strong nuclear force. Gravity, among other things, has unlimited distance. It can, if you have a mass that produces gravity, like the sun, there's no extent to how far that gravity will extend. It can extend for light years and have a very slight gravitational tug on distant stars. The strong nuclear force, by contrast, the reason it's called a nuclear force is because it works in the nucleus of an atom. It has a very short range. And consequently, what the strong nuclear force does is it helps stick together the subatomic particles that make up the nucleus, and it does not extend way beyond the nucleus, which is then Lazar's next bizarre claim that was just so bizarre that it leapt out at me. He claims that the gravity A wave, or the strong nuclear force, in an atom of 115 extends beyond the perimeter of the atom, not the perimeter of the nucleus. In fact, it's true with an atom, the strong nuclear force does very slightly go beyond the nucleus, but because of the way it works, it does not go very far. And if it would not go beyond the all of the electron orbits and of 115 and extend out beyond that. So that kind of claim makes no sense. It sounds like he just doesn't know what he's talking about in terms of physics. So those are some reasons to doubt Lazar's story. We got a lot of instances of missing evidence. We have implausible claims, and then we have scientific claims that just sound like gobbledygook, that don't make any sense.
Okay.
But to go back and revisit the evidence in his favor, well, how did he know what he knew? Because he did know some things that were not common knowledge at the time. And it seems to me that there are a few basic options. One of them is he could have been a real worker at Area 51 or S4. He could have been not reverse engineering a flying saucer, but doing something out there.
There has to be someone mopping the floors, for instance.
Exactly, yeah. Maybe they need photo processing done out at Area 51.
Right.
Get all that gun camera footage and test flight footage and stuff. So he might have actually worked there and then made the rest up. If he didn't work there, he may have known someone who did. He may have had a drinking buddy. There are bars out there around Area 51 and in Las Vegas, and people get to talking over drinks, and he may have known somebody who gave him basic information about, okay, there is an Area 51, there is an S4, things like that, and then he made the rest up. Or if he didn't know somebody out there, he may have just done his research. Even though it wasn't common knowledge, it was known that there was an Area 51 among some people. It was all George Knapp had to do was call, I believe, a press office to get the existence of S4 confirmed. And given that, even though they kind of keep it quiet, there are test flights going on out there at Area 51 and at Papoose Lake. And you could just be a hiker who saw them one day and said, "Ooh, that's interesting. I wonder how often they do that." And, he could have then led people out there to see these things once he figured out the schedule. So I don't see it as being impossible for him to have this knowledge. He may have worked there, he may have known someone who did, or he may have just done his research. When we come to some of his more specific claims, like element 115, well, there had been speculation about higher elements for ages, so that's not new. He could have just picked that up from scientific speculation. Mm-hmm. Gravity waves even as a mode of transport, that's another thing that was part of scientific speculation. You even run across that concept in science fiction. That's essentially what warp drive is in Star Trek.
Right.
Area 51, he could have known about, or NS4 could have known about him from local lore. And then there's this Mike Thigpen guy. Now, he says his background was checked by Mike Thigpen. And in the documentary that Jeremy Corbell did, Corbell says that he contacted Thigpen. He found him and he contacted him. He talked to him. And Thigpen didn't want to go on camera, but admitted that he did do background check work and he did remember Bob Lazar. So he kind of off camera, according to Corbell, so we're trusting Corbell's word here, did kind of sort of confirm parts of Lazar's story. But he didn't say, "I ran a background check on Bob Lazar." At least Corbell doesn't indicate that he said that, which makes me wonder, could Thigpen be the drinking buddy? Mm-hmm. Did Lazar know Thigpen, and Thigpen told him, was a background check agent, and told him about this secret facility he was doing background checks for, and that's where Lazar got some of this knowledge.
The fact is if Mike Thigpen was a federal employee tasked with this sort of secret work, he would still be under legal obligation to not disclose anything about it. I mean,
potentially, yeah. Although he is doing another job now, apparently. But
that requirement continues on even after you've left that job.
It can extend, yeah.
It can. So, I mean, it's plausible. There are plausible explanations for why he would say what he has. That's for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Also, if he was the drinking buddy that gave Lazar all this information, he might not want to admit to that either.
That would also probably be legally a bad idea.
Yeah, stick with the undeniable. Yeah, I did that work, and yeah, I remember Bob Lazar.
Yes.
Just don't ask me about, did we meet in a bar, or what did we talk about there?
Right. Yeah. Okay.
So that kind of brings us to the end of the documentary, where we have the FBI raid, because this, and the way the documentary sets it up, this is presented as if it's evidence for Lazar's claims.
Why would the FBI raid if there was nothing there?
Exactly. Okay. So the idea is, just before we get to the raid sequence in the documentary, Lazar and Corbell go out into the woods and turn off or throw away their mobile phones and make a secret tape that apparently has to do with element 115 and the question of, does Lazar have any of it? And the idea is that they're going to put this recording away somewhere safe so it can be used in the future if needed. And they have this conversation in the woods. And then the next day, the FBI raids Lazar's place of business, which is in Langsburg, Michigan. It's called United Nuclear. And what he does is he sells radiation detectors. He sells special scientific equipment, things like that. Yep. that's how he's making a living these days. Now, according to a title card they put up in the documentary, they say this conversation, the one they had in the woods, was directly referenced during the raid. But they don't say how it was referenced. They don't say what exactly was said, which to me, it starts getting fishy. Why can't you just tell me what you were, how this conversation was referenced? Also, Corbell doesn't show us the conversation. He kind of like speeds up the camera and races through it in a kind of herky-jerky way, so you can't actually tell what they're saying. So we've got this mysterious conversation that they're kind of showing us, but deliberately concealing the content of. And then we're told that it was referenced in this raid, but we're not told what was said about it. The only evidence we're shown on screen that the raid occurred is we have a rear angle photo of a woman wearing a shirt that on the back of it says FBI Evidence Response Team. But we're not shown like video footage of agents, walking around Lazar's place of business or anything like that. And there's no interview. Corbell does not interview an FBI spokesperson about this or what they were trying to do. Instead, he just interviews Lazar, and he interviews Lazar's assistant. According to Lazar, the reason the FBI gave him, and a bunch of other agencies that also showed up, but the reason the FBI gave him is they were looking for information about a customer who 2 years ago purchased potentially toxic material from him. And he kind of laughs at that and dismisses it, says if that's all they wanted, if they just wanted this paperwork, they could have called me on the phone. They didn't need to come in with this massive presence and go through my computers and things like that. So the implication is they're looking for something more than that. They also talked to to Lazar's employee, his assistant, who comments on how dramatic the raid was with all these people there. And he says it's like they didn't know what we had in here. They thought we could have had anything. So they kind of came in loaded for bear. So all this got me to wondering, because they're not, the implication is what the FBI is looking here for is UFO stuff, and specifically that they would be looking to see if Lazar has element 115.
Of course, the question is why now, all these years later? Like what would be
apparently because they just had this conversation, and even though they turned off and threw away their phones in the woods, somehow the FBI was surveilling them. So they just had this conversation. So now's the time to sweep in and try to find the 115 or whatever. Also, one thing I neglected to mention is at the beginning of the film, where Corbell is receiving these texts from Lazar, he's like in a darkened hotel room and his phone lights up and he starts receiving these texts saying FBI raid now and so forth. And to me, I'm quite sure this footage is staged after the fact, as like a recreation of what happened, because I don't think they really had a camera set up and rolling in the darkened hotel room just at the moment the texts start to come in. Right.
That's exactly what I was thinking. It was like, why was the camera conveniently rolling at that point?
Right. So as I was thinking about that, I thought, well, they're obviously reconstructing that. How much of the rest of the story can I trust? And I said to myself, well, if the FBI did raid his place of business, there should be some kind of publicly available record of it. After all, a number of years ago, when they also raided his place of business, there was a public record of it. It made the newspapers.
Right.
So,
and it's a small town, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I thought, well, the first step is try to figure out the date on which this occurred, because then you can look up the record. So I emailed Jeremy Corbell and said, could you tell me, I'm a podcaster, I'm doing this show. I'm going to be talking about your documentary. Can you let me know the date that this happened? And I didn't hear back.
Of course.
So, I don't know. Does that mean he's on a trip? Does that mean he didn't see the email? Does that mean he doesn't want to answer? I don't know. So I also check I go to like Google News, and where you can search all these newspapers all over the world. And there is no reference that I can find to the FBI raiding Lazar's place of business. So I'm starting to get a little more suspicious. So I said, well, let's check with the FBI. So so I called the Michigan FBI, and I spoke with an agent, and the agent was extremely helpful. It turns out the agent was at the raid. So the raid did occur. They were not making that up. And so I want to give them full credit for that. The agent indicated that the agent was personally present. And the agent also said the FBI was at the address executing a search warrant. The agent says, I can't discuss the specifics of the case that brought us to the business, but Mr. Lazar's explanation is accurate. There was no UFO nexus to the search. So apparently Lazar's claim that they were trying to find records connected with a former customer of his who had ordered some potentially dangerous materials was what he was told by the FBI. Now, at this point, I'm going to speculate. I have not asked the FBI about this. I have not asked Jeremy Corbell or Bob Lazar about this. But can I imagine a scenario that would lead the FBI to do this kind of raid? Well, the FBI, being the Federal Bureau of Investigation, investigates federal crimes, not just local things, but violations of federal law. And we know since 9/11 that a big chunk of their duties has been counterterrorism. So if you have a business called United Nuclear and the FBI shows up investigating someone who has ordered hazardous materials from a place called United Nuclear, I would suspect this is part of some kind of counterterrorism investigation, that they're not there because they're worried that the customer is going to hurt himself with whatever he ordered. They're worried the customer is going to hurt other people with whatever he ordered. And it could be something chemical, so it could be a chemical attack, although since it's called United Nuclear, it could be a radiological attack. They might be afraid that the guy's going to build a dirty bomb, which is not the same thing as a nuclear bomb. A nuclear bomb makes a nuclear explosion, which is huge. A dirty bomb uses radioactive material that then gets blown by a normal explosion to irradiate an area. And so I'm thinking some kind of bomb, maybe a dirty bomb, is what they're investigating. And if they're investigating that, it would make sense to me that they would swoop in suddenly and try to go through the computers and seize whatever emails they could have from this guy, from this customer, and other things. And since Bob himself has had some encounters with the law in the past, that they might wonder, is he even in on it? And as the assistant said, it's like they didn't know what we had in here and they came in loaded for bear as a result. So actually, to me, that's a plausible story, even if there's nothing about UFOs here.
But to be clear, we're in no way suggesting that Bob Lazar has committed a crime or is connected to terrorism.
Absolutely not. We are not claiming that. I'm just speculating on why the FBI might have conducted the raid if it wasn't to find element 115 or something otherwise related to UFOs. And why
they might have conducted it in the way that they did, as Bob Lazar himself described it.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good. We don't want to, get ourselves in any trouble by suggesting anything untoward. Just pure speculation based on the facts, not making any claims that any of this is the exact reason why. Okay. So that's astonishing and it's interesting news that you're presenting to us there. So with all of this, what is the bottom line on Bob Lazar's claims about Area 51 and what he may or may not have done there in 1989?
Well, I think it's possible that he may have actually worked at Area 51. So I think it's possible that there is a part of his story that's true. It's also possible that he was just a complete hoaxer who did his research. Either way, though, I don't think that it's likely that his whole story is true. I think we probably have a mix here of both truth and falsity. However, I would say that Lazar does, even though I think he ultimately is to some degree a hoaxer, either that or he was just a dupe of a very elaborate and apparently counterproductive disinformation program, because he made a secret base, now the most famous secret base in the world, which is not what you would do with a disinformation program typically.
Right.
But he would seem to be one of the better hoaxers. He has not gone on the lecture circuit. He has not tried to make a lot of money off this. In fact, he is largely kept out of the public eye for most of the time since 1989. And even according to George Knapp, in 1989, when they were about to broadcast his story, he physically tried to wrestle the videotape away from George Knapp at the television station so it couldn't be aired. And so he may have been having second thoughts even then. And Corbell says something similar happened with this documentary.
Interesting. Yeah, it's very good. I do want to say, with the disinformation campaign, sometimes like a good illusionist will show you something with one hand while he's hiding something with the other. So maybe S4 was this over here on one side.
We got the saucers up here in Utah or something.
Yeah, don't look at N22 or whatever, some other place. So that's entirely possible that he's telling the truth as he perceives it. So that's but it's interesting to look at it in its entirety. So, Jimmy, I know you've got a ton of resources for folks who are more interested in finding out more about this.
There's a lot of information. I'll have links to, I won't go through them all, but I'll have links to the Bob Lazar article on Wikipedia, link to Bob Lazar's homepage, information on Jeremy Corbell, and link to his documentary, as well as articles about a bunch of specific claims, including that critique by a physicist of the physics claims that Lazar has made.
Excellent. And we'll have all of those on our website at sqpn.com. So that's awesome. It's a great story. And undoubtedly there will be future shows in which we'll continue to talk about Area 51 and
aliens in general.
Yes, aliens and associated locations. So
and other specific figures in ufology. Like I mentioned in this episode, Barney and Betty Hill, we'll definitely be talking about them. They were the first major abduction case that got a lot of press attention.
Excellent. So let's get to our mysterious feedback. This time we're going to talk about feedback on our show in which we did an overview of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, and we had some interesting feedback. Let's see, from YouTube. Brian W. says, it was 100% Oswald. It's been studied to death by experts. If it was a conspiracy, it would have been exposed decades ago. How would you respond to that feedback, Jimmy?
Well, it might have been 100% Oswald. I don't dismiss that possibility. On the other hand, people would say it has been studied to death, and a lot of experts have concluded it was not Oswald, and thus it was exposed decades ago.
Okay, right. Just because, there's an equal weight on both sides there, for and against, as we discussed in the show. Okay. From Facebook, Alfredo says, we all know it was CGB Spender.
Yeah. So that's a joke. CGB Spender is possibly the real name, but also possibly an alias of the cigarette smoking man on the X-Files.
Right.
And there's an episode called Musings of a Cigarette Smoking Man, which is a kind of dark version of Forrest Gump, where we learned that the cigarette smoking man has been responsible for all kinds of dark deeds in recent American history, including the assassination of JFK.
X-Files fans, and I'm sure we have many of them in our audience, will appreciate that. Also from Facebook, A. Leo Gregory says, I didn't do it.
I'm sure that's what you would like us to think, A. Leo Gregory.
Let's see. Robert on Facebook says, obviously it was a suicide. Wake up, people.
Yeah, that's a little hard to square with the Zapruder film, but there is death by cop, so this could be an elaborate version of that.
We are open to all possibilities where the evidence leads us. Andrew, also on Facebook, says, will you mention the Secret Service man in the following car that had an assault rifle that went off when he dropped it in the car when he snatched at it after the first shot?
Yeah, so this is a claim that's actually been explored by some conspiracy theorists that one of the Secret Service men in the follow-up car may have dropped his weapon and accidentally caused the fatal headshot. And that then, of course, because this would have been an enormous embarrassment to the Secret Service to kill the president by friendly fire, that it was then covered up. And we will be talking about that in future episodes as we dig down more deeply into individual proposals about the JFK assassination. This was our overview episode to give people a broad look at the subject, but we will be looking at multiple different theories, including Oswald-only theories.
Yeah, there was a lot, like we talked about last week with the simulation hypothesis, there was a lot of feedback on the JFK episode. And so we will definitely be covering more of your feedback in future shows as we talk about this. So, and then what do we have for mysterious headlines this week, Jimmy?
So for mysterious headlines, since we're talking about secret government doings, I thought I'd include a link to a recent article about some new documents that have emerged concerning the MK Ultra program. MK Ultra was a program that was run by the CIA several decades ago, where they were investigating mind control, among other things. They were trying to say, how can we influence people to do what we need them to do, whether that's answer questions or other things. And it was run, or one of the main guys running it was a guy named Sidney Gottlieb. And when the program was eventually shut down, a lot of the documents were apparently destroyed. But there's been a cache of them that has now been released, dealing with mind control, drugs, hypnosis, and things like that. And so I have a link to that. Mm-hmm. Also, related story, have a link to a piece on MK Ultra creating mind-controlled dogs.
Wow.
And this is something also that we've known some of those kind of shadowy government agencies have been involved in. How can you use different animals to get into places where people can't? And can you guide an insect with a listening device on it into a particular location? Can you guide a cat with a listening device on it into a location? That program was known as project was known as Acoustic Kitty. And so apparently we've now got some information about the CIA, or about MK Ultra, working on mind-controlled dogs to get them where they needed to do so they could do what they needed to do. So have a link to that.
I think if you could create mind-controlled dogs or cats, you would be a billionaire. Everyone would buy one. Cat, go in or out the door. Just don't stand in it.
Yeah. Finally, talking about merging animals and machines, I have an article about using amoebas in computers. Apparently, the way certain kinds of amoebas work, they can be tied into computer chips to solve problems, and they're being explored as a potential element of future computing technology. So we may have biomechanical computers before too long.
Wow, it's a little Star Trek in in there. Yeah,
get those cheese gel packs on your ship.
Excellent. Well, that's our serious headlines. Folks, I guess that's going to wrap it up for us this time. So let us know, what did you think about this mystery surrounding Bob Lazar in Area 51 and what Jimmy was able to explain and explore with us? Let us know by visiting sqpn.com/mysterious or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page and leaving us some feedback. Or you can send us an email to mysterious@sqpn.com. Remember to like this episode on our Facebook page or retweet it on Twitter. Subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, your favorite podcast app, or YouTube, where if you do subscribe, hit the bell to get notifications when a new episode is posted. Share the podcast with your friends and write a review in iTunes or wherever you get your podcast to help us grow our community and reach more listeners. the bigger the community, the more interesting the conversation becomes, and so we really appreciate that. You can find the relevant links to the resources from our discussion and links to the mysterious headlines on our show notes on sqpn.com/mysterious. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.